Okay. As I mentioned on Friday, I have not been feeling well. And so I won't be in obviously today, and I am not sure about tomorrow. I was in the ER on Saturday, and they're trying to figure out what's wrong with me. So hopefully I'll get into the doctor either Monday or Tuesday, and then we'll have a little better understanding. But so I'm going to put together this lecture for you, so you're not just sitting there doing busy work. We're going to cover 8.3 today, and then we'll move on and see how the rest of the week kind of works out. So, anyways, focus questions on this section. We talked about the war itself, right? Some of the battles and when did the United States enter, and how did that affect the war, and when Russia pulls out, how did that affect the war? But so section 3 kind of bases focus on what was going on in America during the war, like after war was declared. So it talks about how the government mobilized for the war effort. How did the workers mobilize on the home front? Like, what did the workers do? And then from a government situation, how did they try to influence public opinion? Obviously, when you initiate a war, declare a war, you want the government or you want the public behind you supporting it. And there's a way that, the government tries to, to manipulate and propagandize things to try to get people to buy in. And it's not any different than World War II or, any other wars that go on. All right, so moving on here. Mobilizing the economy. First of all, one of the things the president had to do was to find out how to pay for the war. Obviously, when you go to war, that's a significant amount of money that needs to be allocated to the war effort. And so they passed the War Revenue Act of 1917, which basically established high taxes, taxed the wealthiest Americans, a significant amount to try to raise up money for that. And that goes back to that propaganda piece as well. You try to get people to support you, and they're willing, not necessarily to, they really want to pay higher taxes, but they might be more willing to do it if they knew that the war, was something that needed to be supported. Liberty bonds was another way where they sold bonds to the American people. About $20 billion was raised, so a significant amount of money was raised, which were basically a loan. It's like you would buy a savings bond, and maybe your grandma and grandpa bought you a savings bond when you were young, and it's like 10 or 15 or $50 bonds, whatever they might be. And what basically would happen is the way the government borrows money from you. You would buy the bond for $50. You give the government $50. You get this bond. And after a certain period of time, that bond will, what's called mature, and you will get your $50 back or whatever you paid for it. Plus, you'll get a little bit of interest. Definitely not like a huge amount, but you are guaranteed to get your money back. It's not like a stock where you could potentially lose your money. It's guaranteed, but you're not going to become a millionaire buying savings bonds. That's for sure. All right, but in terms of what the purpose was, is to raise money for the war effort, and it was certainly successful in that regard. As we move together here, we talk about regulating industry. Now we got the money raised, and we know how we want to raise the money. Now we're in a situation where, how we got to make sure that these factories and that these, these farmers and all the other different aspects of the economy are going to buy in as well. Several commissions were created to regulate production and regulate prices, things that would never be allowed to happen during peacetime, but during wartime, it's a little different, right? So there's several regulatory boards to control industry, agriculture, production means, anything along those lines. The War Industries Board was the organization that was probably the most powerful. They oversaw pretty much everything else that went on to make sure that there wasn't any labor issues, strikes, lockouts, anything that's going to disrupt the ability to produce war goods. And they stepped in if that situation potentially occurred. So the military could select any of these goods. Priority was given to the military, and then whatever was left over. For instance, something as mundane as like coffee, right? So the military would say we need X amount of pounds or tons of coffee, and then what was left over was rationed to the American public. So you only got a certain amount, milk, things like of that sort. Metal was rationed. Silk was rationed. Even green dye for paint was rationed. So those types of things were all rationed for the purpose of making sure that the military had what it needed in order to, win the war. In addition to that, you had food being regulated. There was the Liver Food and Fuel Control Act, which gave the government, as I mentioned, the ability to control prices, control production, making sure that everything was getting to where it needed to be. The Victory Gardens was a famous thing, right? Where the American public was urged to grow gardens in their yards, that they could grow tomatoes, or they could grow any types of produce that would, they wouldn't have to go out and buy it. So that would mean that it would be more available for the war effort. So some of maybe your grandma, grandpas, and maybe your parents have, like, they grow tomatoes in the backyard or whatever. Even in major cities like in New York, they would actually put these gardens on rooftops and do it that way. So that was another way that the American public would try to buy in. They had things like meatless Mondays, where the American public agreed not to consume any meat on Mondays, and wheatless Wednesdays. So the same thing goes with wheat, which is obviously, bread and cereals, things of that sort. So, just a way that they could control the consumption of those types of foods to make sure that the war effort had what it needed to have in order to again, make sure the war effort is being successful. It was highly successful. Most Americans bought in. You had that sense of patriotism, right? It was very similar after 9/11. There was a significant amount of Americans who donated blood. Matter of fact, the Red Cross had to start turning people away during that time period. People, Americans and people in general tend to are willing to, step forth when there's a crisis or when there's something that needs to be done. Fuel administration. So obviously it's the same thing. Main activities was to make sure that you could stimulate an increase in the production of fuel, which is basically coal at this point. Voluntary consumption. In other words, again, getting people to voluntarily not use coal if they couldn't. There was gasless Mondays where Americans would not use gas. There wasn't a lot of cars around. 1917 though, the Model T's out, so there is that thing as well. It also restrict consumption of non-essentials. So making sure that we understand the fact that anything that is used could be advantage. So there's going to be some restrictions on consumption, even not only on people but by industries as well. As I mentioned before, another part of that was to regulate the distribution of coal, making sure that coal wasn't being abused or being used by businesses or areas that weren't necessarily maybe that important at that point. And also they started to fix prices so that they could control the amount of goods and demand and supply. And then daylight savings time was introduced, something that we are familiar with. Matter of fact, you're coming up pretty quick here. We're going to kick it in again, where you lose an hour of sleep or gain an hour of sleep. That was actually introduced back by Ben Franklin back in the colonial times, but it wasn't really used until 1918. And it was a way that they felt they could consume and reduce energy use and use the sun as a source of energy in terms of light and things and heat instead of using coal or natural gas, which was a little bit later on. Actually, once the war was over, daylight savings time went away, and then it was reinstituted in 1966. So I know the obvious question is going to be, well, why do we have it now when we didn't? It was not a thing after the war. Well, the Johnson administration, which was president during 1966, decided that was a way to, again, same thing, try to conserve fuel, make it a little easier for people to work, and they try to use daylight in the sun as a way of preserving fuel. Mobilizing workers. Again, you could not have issues regarding people deciding that they want to strike during the war effort because you couldn't lose that production hours. So the government oversaw those type of things. And also, when you needed to produce war goods, there was a significant amount of demand put on workers. They had to work long hours in situations where weren't necessarily the safest. And so, people were willing to do that, no doubt about it. But labor unions started to pick up a little bit of membership because of it, because they felt like maybe that some of these factories were maybe taking advantage of them, of their patriotism and things of that sort. There was instances where there were about 6,000 strikes, mostly due to, again, workers feeling that some of the memberships, the management of these factories were taking advantage of their patriotism and making them work and so forth. The National Labor Board was created to make sure that that situation was monitored and that some of these stoppages or strikes would not disrupt the war effort. And if it did, the government would step in and arbitrate, how this, labor strife would get solved. Women's contribution to the war: many women stepped in as they did in World War II and took the jobs of men. You can see the picture there, women working in a factory setting. About 1 million women entered the workforce. Today that's not a big deal, obviously. Most of your parents, mom and dad, probably work, or if you have a grandma and grandpa who are working age, they probably work as well. But back then, women working was not a thing. Not nearly what it is today. But when the war ended, most of those women returned back to their more traditional roles. However, it did really give some momentum to the suffrage movement, where women kind of used that as a way of convincing people that, if we're good enough to work in factories and take on jobs that men were doing, we should be able to have the right to vote. And that was a huge motivation, a huge compliment to women in allowing that suffrage movement to get passed on. Finishing up here, another after effect of the war was the influenza epidemic that occurred, similar to the COVID thing that went on here, a couple of years ago, right? There was a huge amount of concern over the flu. It was kind of a strand of the flu that was born along the Western Front, along the trenches and things of that sort, brought home by American soldiers, and it started showing up in the American public. Specifically, and it started, I think, identified in Iowa at first, but it spread throughout, much like COVID did. People were wearing masks. You look at some of the articles from that time period, and a lot of the same articles, arguing over whether I should have to wear a mask or not, or schools being shut down and things of that sort. So by the time it was all said and done, about 675,000 Americans had died because of this specific brand of the flu. It was called the Spanish flu, which really had nothing to do with Spain. It's just kind of what they did. There is a story behind what it was named. It's not really that important to know, but so that was a kind of a thing along the home front too. Is this flu epidemic that occurred in 1919 into the 1920s. Oh, I'm going to show you. You can see the guy wearing the mask there. That's that picture from that time period. Something that unfortunately we all can identify with, right? Finishing up here, influencing public opinion. Congress declared war, because we talked about that in April of 1917, and immediately to try to gain public support. But on the other side of that thing, they had to try and stop potential, groups that were against the war and tried to spread, ideas and spread propaganda to try to get people to understand that, hey, you don't have to support the war. It's your constitutional right. There's huge posters put out by the government as well to gain support. There's things such as don't talk, people are listening type of thing, especially specific to German Americans. There was another one that said, loose lips sink ships. If your son writes you a letter and tells you, hey, we're here or there, don't reveal that information. Letters that were written home by soldiers were censored, to making sure that nothing that could potentially harm the war effort was being, put out in the public. Anti-German feelings significantly increased. Many Americans questioned German loyalty. Again, we talked about this earlier, but there was a significant amount of German Americans who had just arrived from Germany within the last decade. And they probably have brothers, uncles, maybe dads or whatever, still there fighting. And so the American public was under the assumption that these people potentially would have more loyalty to their family, to their homeland, than they would to the country which they just moved into. That necessarily wasn't true, but that was the concern. That was the paranoia that was going A famous court case, which was the Schnick versus United States, where a member of the American Socialist Party was convicted of violating the Espionage Act. And espionage means spying, if you didn't know that, where he basically distributed leaflets, right, for First Amendment right, saying that the draft violated the 13th Amendment because it was considered to be involuntary servitude. Like when you were drafted, you didn't have a choice to go; you had to go. So, in his case, that basically was slavery being reinvented by the government. He's also charged with conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act. He was convicted. The Supreme Court ruled against him, saying that, yeah, you do have First Amendment rights, but the First Amendment rights are significantly limited during wartime in order to control the amount of information that's going out and to continue to support the war effort. As I mentioned, the First Amendment does not protect your right to speak out against the war. Of course, now if that happened today, it'd be a little different ruling, but of course, this is 100 years ago. And that was where the term clear and present danger came about, from that ruling, from one of the judges who wrote the opinion of the court. He used the phrase, it presents a clear and present danger. And if the government can substantiate that, then you could be convicted of violating the Espionage Act. And again, as I mentioned, if that happened today, it'd be a little different outcome, I feel, regarding that court case. All right, that's it. A couple things. You have your information regarding the Section 3. So we're done with that. We'll cover Section 4. I'm not sure when I'll be back. I'm hopeful to get into the doctor either Monday or Tuesday. And I'll have a little better understanding of what's going on. So, behave yourself, please. Don't cause problems. You have your map studies, your post-World War I map studies that you can work on after this lecture. And then tomorrow I'll have another one for you if I'm not there, which will be on obviously Section 4. So, all right. Any questions, just email me, and then hopefully everything will be fine, and I'll be back shortly.